Alright, so I got the top shaft, counter shaft, whatever you want to call it, out of the transmission over here on the bench. I'm going to work on getting the two bearings off of it. So to do that, I'm probably going to have to press them off. And I'm going to use a bearing splitter underneath the bearings to get them off. And as you see, I have some rust on this gear, as well as a couple other gears. I'm going to put those into electrolysis and see if I can clean that off. But I'm going to set this splitter. Okay, so I got the bearing splitter on this one. We're going to take it over to the press, stick the press plates underneath it and press it off. And I don't know if I caught it on video, since my camera just messed up on me. The bearing on this end, I stuck that splitter underneath it and basically just pulled it right off with my hand. Which it doesn't appear to be spinning, but I just didn't have a good grip on it apparently. And this bearing is a 14138. So let's take this over to the press and get this other bearing off. And then I'm going to stick it in my electrolysis and get this rust off of here. Okay, so I just have a wrist pin here, I think out of an 8N, on the center of that shaft. And we're just going to press the shaft out of the bearing. And so I started to press on this. I noticed this bolt was really bending because I didn't really get underneath this one very well. So I stuck my larger separator under here to try to get a little bit better hold on it. Okay. So there it popped free. And there's the shaft out. This bearing looks like a 7687. So now this is ready to go into the electrolysis. Okay, I've mentioned electrolysis in a couple of my videos so far, and I haven't really showed anything about it, which I'll probably do another video later on explaining it a little bit better in detail. But basically I have a non-conductive container full of water and baking soda, or washing soda, either one works. I have a scrap piece of metal, which is just a piece of steel with a positive electrode on it, which I have hooked up to a 12-volt power supply. And as for the part that we're going to clean, in this case my gear, I'll wrap a piece of welding wire to it. And this gets hooked to a negative electrode. So I'm going to have to add some water to it due to evaporation. I'm about an inch too shallow. Then I'm going to take my negative electrode and I'm going to just hook it up to the wires. So I'm pulling 0.9 amps. That gear is now derusting and cleaning up basically. And if you watch this stuff, if you do this, you'll see little bubbles coming up. That is supposedly hydrogen. But the bubbles means it's working. And I'll let that sit there for a couple hours and then come back and pull it out. I know I've mentioned this in my other videos, but I haven't in this particular segment here. When you go to press these, if you feel any resistance, you need to stop and figure out what's wrong. These things should go on really smoothly. Just press that until it seats. Now this is the bearing that initially for me just slid right off. And even now it's going on really easily. Press it until it fully seats. So there's both bearings on our cluster gear. Okay, I got the Pto Shifter Assembly over here chucked up in the vise just so I can disassemble it, clean it up really well, and change the seal and the bearing race. If you don't want to disassemble it, you can actually just change the bearing race and the seal from this end. But I'm going to disassemble everything, inspect it all, make sure everything's good and clean, and then change those parts as well. So there's not too much to this mechanism. You just have an in and out on the PTO. So there is a detent right here with a spring and a ball in it. So be aware of that whenever you pull this shift rail out, that it's going to come out. But there's a 9/16 nut right here. Just unscrew it. I have a nut and a lock washer. And if you have your PTO lever pulled towards the rear of the tractor, you should be able to let this fall and get out your PTO shift fork. And then your actual PTO spline coupler. So now we'll just lift this shaft up and out. And you can see where our detent would ride. That one there got a pretty good groove on it. So I might be able to rotate this and get it out of that groove. If you have your magnet on hand, you can reach in here and grab that ball and spring, which I don't at the moment. And mine just fell out and went rolling across the floor. But there's the little ball. Mine looks pretty good. If you see any flat spots, you might have to replace it. And my PTO spring is actually broken. So it's probably a good thing I actually took this apart, even though it worked. With it being broken, I'll have to replace that spring. So I don't really plan on using the PTO much on this tractor, but I do want it to work properly in case I ever do. Now, as for getting this race out, you have two options here. You can take and weld a bead all the way around it and let it cool, and it'll contract, and then that race will fall out. Or there is a very, very slight lip here that a slide hammer may grab. So if you have a slide hammer, you can try that first. If not, you'll have to weld it. And then our seal will slide out. I don't think the seal will slide past this race. It don't look like it. Okay, so I tried to slide hammer this race out. Well, my slide hammer wouldn't go underneath the race, so I ended up welding it. I welded these two little nubs on here, as well as doing 360 degree on here. These little nubs is where my slide hammer could grab and then pull. If you don't have a slide hammer, you can still just weld a circle all the way around it and let it cool off, and it'll basically just fall out of the housing here. Now this race has a number on it of 26,823. So now the next thing to come out is going to be the seal. And to get it out, you can either slide hammer, maybe a pry bar, but it's probably going to end up being a slide hammer. Okay, so what I'm doing here, I took a drill and I just drilled into the top of the seal, the metal part of the seal, and I'm now threading two screws into it that I'm going to use to pull the seal out. So now that I got those two screws down in there, now it looks like this seal is going to come apart in pieces in here. So I had it screwed all the way into this metal piece, was hoping it'd pull that. Here's the other lip. This is actually a double lip seal in between our transmission and our hydraulics. Alright, I might have to try and just collapse the outside of this seal down in there. So once I got the rubber out, I was able to go in there a little better and grab a hold to the case and pull the case out with a slide hammer. Our PTO shifter is now ready to go into the electrolysis tank. Okay, so we got the PTO shifter all cleaned up. First thing I'm going to do is install this new seal. Now, even though this is a PTO seal, it is different from the PTO seal in the rear housing and at the actual rear of the housing where the shaft comes out of the tractor. This seal is a 472-185. And you can see that's a national number. Now this one is a whole lot thinner than the one that came out. So when we put this one in, we have to be aware of that. But we still want to drive this one all the way down until it stops. And once again with the spring facing up. Okay, so there's the seal installed down in there all the way. New race, number 26823. I'm gonna drive it in until it stops. So there's our new race. Okay, so the next thing to do is get the actual coupler in here, the shift fork, shift rail detents. Alright, so to install the actual shifting part of the PTO, first thing we're going to do is put in the coupler. If you look at the coupler, you'll see a big diameter here with some pointed dog teeth on it. And this is a smaller diameter with just some splines. Your dog teeth is what engages into the PTO shaft in the transmission. So that needs to go down towards the transmission. And I'm going to go ahead and just put my fork down in there. Next thing I'm going to do is put in a new, well, this technically isn't new, but this is it's actually a detent spring, but it's the same spring for the detents and this PTO detent. But it's new in the fact that it's not broken. So I'm going to slide that in, and then we're going to take our little detent ball and slide it in. Which unfortunately this is easier said than done. Especially whenever gravity's wanting to fight you. However, if you do it that way, it just slid right in. So do it that way, not the way I was doing. Then we're going to install the shift rail. And I'm going to put mine in there to where these two grooves that are cut into it already don't hit that ball. Alright, so when you push down on that with the punch, and then slide the shaft in. And hopefully it won't be like me and take 3 tries to get it. So the next thing is going to be the fork. Just put it on there and slide it on. And then we have a lock washer and the nut. I could not find the torque spec for this in the manual, so just make sure it's good and tight. Okay, just verify that your shifter works. Okay, so there's that PTO shifter rebuilt, ready to go back onto the rear of the transmission. Okay, so I got the output support bearing housing here. We're going to put our new bearings and seals in. First part we're going to install is the seal. It's a number 473445. Our next roller bearing, and this is a NTN Bauer bearing, is the M-1208EL. And the last is going to be a race, a Timken number 28920. When we install this seal, if we have the housing like this, we want to install it with the spring facing up. And whenever you install this thing, you're going to push it all the way until it seats flush. Okay, so there's the seal installed. We're going to make sure it goes flush against this lip back here, because this is the machine lip. This one in here is just cast, so it may not be square. So you may have to take a punch and just go around the edge of that seal and knocking it down. Okay, next up is our bearing. Same thing, just knock it down until it's flush. New bearing installed. And then lastly we have our race. This is the biggest adapter I have, and it's too small. So I'm going to take and just see if I can just tap it around with a hammer and get it in. Just make sure it seats flush and you're done. This race actually sticks up above this flat piece, so when you hammer it down you're still going to get it flush, because you're getting it flush inside, not on the top. So there's the output housing, all rebuilt, ready to go back onto the transmission. Okay, I've got the output gear here, getting ready to push a new bearing on it. Didn't film removing the bearing. It's pretty simple though. Both this gear and the PTO drive gears have these holes in the rear of them. Just take a punch, knock out the bearing from this side. That's all you got to do. Alright, speaking of the bearing that goes right here, this one here is a 28985. We'll set it on there and just press it until it stops. And there's a new bearing on our output gear. Now this in here is actually machined into the gear. There is no race here to change. And the next gear I'm going to focus on is our PTO gear. And the two bearings that we're going to use for this are a 24780, which is the bearing on top, and a 24720, which is the race. I'm going to put the race in first. These two holes right here you can use to knock the bearing out off of this side. And even with the race in there, you can still access those two holes. But this race, I got this race out by welding a bead around it and putting the little nubs on it and using a slide hammer, and it basically just fell right out. Just run that race in until it seats. Okay, so there's that race installed. And it's actually pretty flush here. Might be just a little bit under that lip, but it's pretty flush. So now we'll flip it over and we'll put in our bearing. Once again, just press it until it seats. So there's our bearing installed. Alright, so I have the PTO input shaft over here on my press. And we're going to put a new needle bearing in here and a new seal in here. The bushing in this rear I'm not changing, mainly due to cost, and this one's still in decent shape. Now, I didn't film taking this seal and the bearing out. The way that I took this bearing and seal out was I actually took and flipped this shaft over and stuck a screwdriver down in the bottom down here and just hit it with a hammer and knocked the bearing and the seal out. And there's two reasons I did that. One being this bearing, which I don't know if I can get it on camera or not, but I'm actually missing a needle in here. That was the main reason for replacing this bearing. The second being, whenever I hit it with the screwdriver, you can see it dented it right here. So with the missing needle, you know, that was a cause for replace, and then when I damaged it, that's two causes, you know, due to me wanting to replace it. I think that bearing is available from a New Holland dealer. However, I think it's almost $50. This Koyo bearing here, this B-1710, pretty sure that's not going to pick up, but a B-1710 crosses over. However, same inner and outer diameters, but it's about 1/8 of an inch thicker. Well, 1/8 inch, we have room in our shaft for that. So being that extra 1/8 inch thick is not going to hurt, it's actually going to help. It'll carry a little more load. Well, this bearing has no grease in it, so I'll be sure to pack that with grease before I put it back into the transmission. And here's our input shaft seal that goes into the center here. This is not the big one, this is just the small one. So this is going to be only on the double clutch transmissions. The SKF, Chicago Rawhide number, at 10515. Bearing can be installed either way. Your seal is going to be installed with the spring towards the gear. So I'm going to press these in. You can hammer these in, but be aware that if you hit this bearing too hard, you will knock needles out of it. So find a way to support those if you're going to hammer it. Set the bearing down in there. And these bearings, now this bearing should go in fairly easily. I believe mine actually just fell into place. And it did. So that has me a little worried. Okay, so like I said, this one just slid right in here. I'm not sure if it's due to the cleaning method I used or what, but this is the right bearing. So I went back and measured it. It measures the same as the old one, so I don't know what's up with that. So I'm just going to add a little bit of Loctite to it just to try to help lock it to the shaft a little bit, because I don't want it to spin and mess up the PTO shaft while the input shaft is turning. It's basically just going to kind of glue this bearing into place a little bit. So like I say, since it just slides right in. But as you can see, even being an 1/8 inch thicker, it went all the way down nice and flush. And that Loctite should set up and hold the bearing just fine. So that bearing's now glued in there, for a lack of a better term. That's just low strength thread locker, so it can be removed in the future if need be. Now the seal has this green paint on it, so there's no need for any kind of RTV or Loctite, shellac, anything of that nature. Just install it as it is. And if we look in here, you'll see a little bit of a stop, if you want to call it that. It's kind of an angle before it goes down to the bearing. That's how. If we look down in here, you'll see like a little stop or an angle before it goes to where the bearing race is. That's how far in we want to push this seal. So pretty much just push it in until it stops. It's right there. And there's our new seal installed. Okay, so I got the throwout bearing retainer over here in my vise. We're going to change the input shaft seal. Now this is the second input shaft seal. The first one's in the PTO. Okay, so to get this seal out, you're going to just take a pry bar. We're going to come in here and just barely catch the lip of this seal and pry it up and out. Now don't go too far because you don't want to get over here and scratch your housing, because then you're going to have a leak. Our new seal, it's a 19831. And we're going to install it. Since we have paint here, we're going to install it dry with no RTV or anything, and we're going to install it with the spring facing up. And we're going to install this to where it's down flush on the bottom, not flush here. Okay. And I ended up finding this bearing race, which is actually out of the transmission. Yeah, so you can use this race to install your input shaft seal, which comes out of this retainer. And I didn't film it, but you see the two notches right there. You can either flip it over, drive it out with a punch, you know, those two notches, or you can even grab the slide hammer and knock it out that way. New input shaft seal installed. Now as for this race here, a 14274. This we can just press in using our press, or hammer it in with their install tools. You're just going to hammer this in until it's nice and flush. New race installed. Okay, here I got the lower cap for the main shaft in the front of the transmission. I'll put new race in it. The race for this one, 24720. And we're just going to press it in until it stops. New race installed. So to check these hydraulic tubes, I'm going to pull a vacuum on them. Well, before I can pull a vacuum, I've got to plug these two ports right here. So I just have a couple of silicone stoppers. And we're just going to put those in there. Make sure they're good and tight. Then we're going to come back here to the rear of the transmission. Okay, we have this vacuum pump with a little suction cup on it. And that cup will fit around the end of that pipe. I'm just going to put about 10 inches of mercury on it. And I'm going to sit there and watch that gauge and see if it holds vacuum. If it holds vacuum, that tube is good. If it leaks down, if it's a fast leak down, you know, there's a severe leak. If it's a slow leak down, there's probably a pinhole. But as you see, mine's pretty much holding steady, so I'll sit here and watch it for a little bit, and then I'll check the other side. As you see, it's pretty much not moving. Kind of wants to wiggle a little bit whenever I move my hand and loosen vacuum down at the port. But it's pretty much holding steady, so I'm going to call that tube good. So then we'll switch over to our other tube, and we'll do the same thing. So I got about 11 inches right there, which it appears to be holding as well, so I'm going to say this tube's good too. So we don't have to change these tubes. If you have to change these tubes, you can buy these, I'm pretty sure. I've seen people separate tractor and drive these out towards the front. I've seen some people grab them up front with like a bolt and pull them out with a slide hammer and just different stuff. So if you have to do that, I'm sure you can find a video somewhere of somebody having to do that. But since mine don't need to be changed, I'm not going to risk damaging anything to do that. So unfortunately, I don't have a video of that. But hopefully you'll be like me and they're perfectly fine and you can just run them. So I got the clutch cross shaft here, and I went ahead and blasted it and painted it, and then I started looking at it. These bushings that I got to go on it, I actually bought aftermarket ones since the ones from New Holland are stupid expensive. So they're a little shorter than the originals. However, they're a 1-inch diameter inside, an 1.1 inch outside, which is what we need. Whenever I put them on the shaft, they're nice and tight. You know, out here in the middle where there's no wear, but out here where they ride, they're really loose. So I'm gonna think and just weld this up and then grind it back down smooth to where these are a nice snug fit. And like my other videos, I won't show any welding, but I will show the finished product before I install it. Okay, and here's the finished product after welding it up and sanding it down. This blue here is a little bit of metal check. This side I actually ground a lot better by hand versus this side. So that's why this is nice and shiny, because I had to go stick it in a belt sander to get it nice and flat. But now I got it all nice and flat. The bushing, it's nice and tight. Slides all the way across and all the way to the other side. So now I just got to repaint it.